My name is Raya Morris Edwards. I wrote the Sovereign Mountain series. I currently write dark cowboy and country romance with lots of spice, a little bit of action and adventure, and happily ever afters.
Welcome to Love Letters and Books, a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. This is a soft space to explore romance and books where no topic is too taboo. I'm your host, Casey, and this week I'm sitting down with Raya Morris Edwards, the author of the Sovereign Mountain series, a contemporary dark cowboy romance with a timeless feel. I instantly fell in love with Raya's writing from the very first chapter in her book, Sovereign, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about this series, which includes the books Sovereign, Westin, Deacon, and the soon-to-be-released books Jensen and Jack. There is something so captivating, beautiful, and wild in Raya's writing. She transforms a place into a character, a flawed main male character into the ultimate anti-hero, all while building a life for her main female characters that go from harsh and hopeless to soft and sensual. Today, we'll explore how themes of trauma and deprivation give way to storytelling about connection and self-discovery. And we'll discuss how these very flawed, very real human relationships are explored through intimacy, communication, and kink. And make sure to stay with us to the very end, as Raya will share a beautiful love letter that she wrote for her readers. Raya, welcome to the Love Letters and Books podcast. I am so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I have been very excited for this. I know we've been talking a little bit before this, but I am super excited to kind of get the chance to talk about these books.
I picked up your books, the Sovereign Mountain series. That's how I found you, and I immediately fell in love. Your storytelling, your characters, the setting, and I am really excited to just go deep and touch on all the layers that really stood out for me and learn more about you as a writer. So let's jump into that series, the Sovereign Mountain series. I opened this book. I think I was probably attracted to it because I used to live in Wyoming, and I just love the idea of stories set in the mountains outside in Montana. And one thing I noticed immediately was there was this timelessness that came through in your stories. And so it's this contemporary dark romance, dark cowboy romance, and yet it feels like it could be set in 1940s or it could be set in 1990. It just was so incredible. So drop us in and tell us a little bit about the Sovereign Mountain series.
So, first, I just want to talk about the timeless thing a little bit because I get that a lot. And I was very surprised by that. Like, that was one of the comments I remember getting from my developmental editor for that book. They were like, this kind of feels like it could be at any point, I guess. I mean, some of it's by design. Like, there's obviously not a lot of like technology use in the books. There's not a lot of things to pinpoint it to a specific time and place, not a lot of like pop culture references, that kind of thing. But I think that each book in the series draws a lot of inspiration from like older stories, fairy tales. I would say I always kind of double down that they are fairy tales to some degree. Sovereign is the first in series. It is a dark cowboy, sort of dark country stalker romance. I call it my 50 Shades of Yellowstone series, which is funny because I had never seen Yellowstone when I wrote it. Like, I didn't know what was going on when people started kind of comparing it. And so I was like, well, I got to go back and I got to do like a crash course and watch all of this. But yeah, Sovereign is the first. Westin is the second, Deacon is the third, and that one goes back more into kind of what you would see in a lot of dark romances, like it's a stalker, it's like that kind of thing. They are all high spice, high heat BDSM. They are all age gap. They all focus on like BDSM, sort of like kink as healing, trauma, and sort of like working through that. They're very gritty. I would say that they have some like maybe even like grit lit influences. And I think they all talk about like men behaving badly.
And it's interesting to me because in the midst of all of the things that you just mentioned, I was noticing that you are building a life for your main female characters that go from very harsh and hopeless to soft and sensual. So you would almost imagine in this very rustic and rugged environment where they are with these men who are they're many things. They're rugged,
Mhm.
they're intense, they're
Yeah.
stalkerish, they've got all of these things, and yet in this incredible combination, it creates this softness that begins to unfold in your main female characters' lives. So, I would like to touch on that for a moment. You as a writer being in the position to tell the story any way you want, why was it that combination that we saw throughout the series?
I think there's a combination of sort of the harshness to kind of a softer environment is really important on a lot of different levels, and I think it's built throughout the book in a lot of different ways. And I think the series at its heart is a story about women at very pivotal points in their lives. And a lot of them, if you haven't read the series, it usually is a female main character who is kind of in a bad situation. It could be financial, it could be they're in an abusive relationship. Sometimes it's like they have food deprivation, like they have food scarcity, that kind of thing. And I think that ultimately the series is about sort of healing from that place where we start, that place of harshness, and then going into a place where all of your needs are met and understanding that sort of you as a person, I'm talking kind of to the female main characters in this context, deserve that and that those are all of the components of the life that you want, that they want. And that's in every level, whether it's like small things in their lives like food, like shelter, clothing, to, wanting a partner that respects them and treats them well and wanting an environment where they feel safe.
Yeah, and you see how that can be so alarming, right, for your characters at first because it's not what they're used to. Not a single one of them was walking into this with a foundation of that. They were actually almost in a state of hypervigilance. That's what I picked up on
Mhm.
as the reader, where they're always looking over their shoulder, can't relax in any way, and they don't know what's coming around the corner, but it's probably not good. And so to
Mhm.
make that shift into that softness, to be able to rest, to relax, to be at ease, to feel that warmth in every area of your life, that really jumped off the page for the readers, I think. And that's what made it just so powerful. And then it's interesting because you mentioned food. And that is something that stood out to me so much in your writing. And at first I thought, God, am I being kind of weird about this? That I'm picking up on the way she's writing food and the way she's writing the meal times and the sharing. And I thought, food deprivation or food scarcity is one of the ways that people abuse one another. And it's a way to control someone else, to make them feel like there's always a sense of lack. And it's very harmful and it's very powerful. And then we find in your stories that food plays such a part where it becomes the center of so many conversations, so many interactions, where people actually feel safe sitting down at a table and enjoying a meal with someone else. And even just that act alone, for anyone who's listening who grew up in a house where you couldn't do that safely, it's a big deal when that happens. So I would love to talk about food in your writing and food as nourishment, food as a way to soothe, food as a way to connect, food as a way to express. Why was that important for you? And why did it show up so much in these stories?
I mean, I think for me, having the food in the story be so prevalent because it is, there's a lot of different reasons, and it sort of depends on the book. I think with Sovereign, the food is more sort of a metaphor for Kira finding her autonomy, whereas you see her with her first husband. She's doing a lot of domestic labor, unpaid domestic labor, producing food for like large amounts of people. And then she goes through sort of this period of where she doesn't have to. She met this guy who's like, you don't need to do that, and you can kind of just take time and figure out who you are without being the person who's just doing things for everyone else. But then they get to a point in time, if you've read Sovereign, it's the point where they go into the mountains. That is at the point where Kira voluntarily cooks for Sovereign and is like, I choose to do this out of my own free will. So I think that is kind of the importance of it in the context of sovereign. For Deacon, the 3rd book in the series, it's a little different because it's very much like it's like a cultural thing for Freya. Like, she's from Appalachia, he's from out in Montana, but also it's just different for her because she wants to do this. She just wants to be able to kind of choose who she's doing this for. Like, she likes cooking, she works at a bakery kind of thing. So I think it's very much different and does different things. The presence of food as such a heavy, strong thread throughout the series for each book and each set of characters. However, there is that overarching theme of it being kind of a way to kind of test, like, how is that household? Is it going well? Like, are people getting along? And you can kind of test that by going to the center of the home, which is people eating and eating together. Like, you see that a lot going back to Deacon, where Freya is in a bad home environment and she has a bad time when they sit down to eat. Like, it's not enjoyable for her. It's very much like an eggshell, walking on eggshells experience. So, yeah, I think the food in the series is always there for a reason. It always means something, and it sort of always follows the arc of where the male or female character is at that time. It's kind of like checking the temperature of it almost, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Oh, absolutely. No, it really does. And I'm so glad we're talking about it because you are touching on so many really deep themes. Yes, there's high heat and high spice and high love and like high all of those things. But in your writing, you're touching on trauma, deprivation, sexual trauma, grief, self discovery, all of these big emotions. And I love that we're also getting those temperature checks in a different way. And food was a really
Mm.
beautiful way to do it and how people respond and react to each other. And I think it just made it so powerful and poignant, but it was also a really unique way to do that. So I love that you used food to move through all of those things. And then when it comes to those themes I just mentioned, why was that important for you to incorporate into these books? Because these people are really going through it. They have gritty stories, they have emotional stories, they have real stories. The things that are happening to your characters happen to women all of the time, and we don't talk about it. So why was it so important for you to put that in these books and share their journey of softening and self discovery and safety?
I think I relate to it a lot, sort of going through this period of time where you see, like, you grow up, you're in your early 20s, and you sort of see things a little more clearly. And I think that's why a lot of the women in the series, they're all around that age. It's a very sort of like formative and shocking, not necessarily in a good way, time when you kind of go out into the world and you have to contend with it. And I think that a lot of these things that are written into it are things that I have firsthand experience with. And I think there are a lot of things that don't get addressed sometimes in an indirect way. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of things that are sort of built into the structure of society and, the way that we live that we don't even know, especially as like a young woman. You may not know that that is something that is an issue or that is causing you harm. So I wanted to portray these characters in the most authentic way that I could, dealing with these things that are issues for many, many people, but also have been for a long time. A lot of these things are also things that, women in my family for generations have dealt with, like 5 generations, that kind of thing. And it's just this sort of consistent story that gets told again and again. And I just wanted to see it on page and also write through it in the context of things that I had experienced and be able to just write it out and get the clarity of it, but also maybe open up a space for discussion for people who may not have realized that some of these things they experienced were not good, not great for them, that caused a lot of harm to them.
Yeah, that really does stand out for me in your writing. And I always think how powerful it is when someone writes a book that it's going to attract a wide audience. And it might be the very first time that a reader realizes that some of the things that you are putting into the story are abuse or are traumatizing. Because whether it's our family, society, or our own minds just trying to keep us safe and survive, we can block those things out. So It was interesting because you were highlighting the experience that spans verbal, emotional, financial, sexual abuse, and even the coercion or the implicit threat that people can sometimes say, well, you didn't actually get hit, right? But
Yeah.
there's that implicit threat of, I am rearing my arm back and I'm like about to do something to you. And to live under that changes who you are as a person. It changes how you see the world, how you see yourself, how you see relationships. And so, what I always think is really interesting is, especially in this genre, we're talking about romance. And a big part of that is how we see relationships, how we see our partners, how we see ourselves. And it's so powerful when you're putting that in the story. So, let's just go a little deeper into that because you touched on it, right? Like you're talking about some things that may not be initially perceived as abuse under the guise of not bad enough. And yet here you are showing like it's harming these women. And there's another life that they could be living. What's it like to know that you might be the first time that someone realizes that they're in an unsafe situation? Because for them, it was the house they grew up in. It was the house their mom grew up in. It's what they see in their future. And they're reading your book, and it's almost like that light going off of like, oh my God, she's writing about me. That's me. Or there's another way. Or I'm reading this book and I'm feeling these women having this expansive experience where they can soften and they're not worried all the time. And I want that for myself. So, what's that like to
Yeah.
be the writer?
I think knowing that someone might read that and it's the first time that they realize that makes me write very carefully. It makes me run my books through beta readers, through sensitivity reader, that kind of thing. I think ultimately when it gets down to it, I sort of wish that I had been the reader, maybe 5, 10 years ago, and that these things had been pointed out to me. It would have made the world make a lot more sense. And I'm saying that as not as saying I think that I'm the perfect person to say these things sort of. I am just to the best of my abilities saying the thing that I feel needs to be said for the stories that I'm telling. But I have heard from a lot of people who have this shared experience, and sometimes it's terrible. 'Cause you don't want that, but it is interesting, and people do reach out and they say, like, "I had this exact experience." I had a lot of people reach out when I published Deacon saying, like, the feeling of being in an sort of eggshell household, a chaotic and unstructured and sort of unsafe household was very visceral, and that they understood it and that they had experienced it but maybe hadn't sort of metabolized it and understood it very well. And that type of environment is important to point out because it causes a lot of problems for you as an adult that you may not know. It manifests in a lot of ways that if you don't know what's going on, it causes you a lot of problems. So, unfortunately, I think a lot of these things that we don't really see as like abuse, making someone grow up in a household that is incredibly unstable, where they don't know how to navigate the people around them and everyone around them is kind of in a position of power over them, like that manifests as adults with a lot of problems. So I think it's really important that people see those things as well and address them. Otherwise, they just kind of get worse and worse.
Yeah, no, and I'm so appreciative of you for talking about this and going deeper and just exploring why it's important to share these stories and knowing who your audience is, and that it is a really powerful way to connect with people through sharing stories. And I thought, as you were saying, I wish I had been the reader. I mean, I teared up when you were saying that because I was thinking, yeah, me too. I do. I wish when I was a lot younger, I had been exposed to that because I think it would have changed a lot of things. So just
Mhm.
thank you for talking about this in your books and really exploring it in a way where the reader can feel safe. And I'll definitely touch more on that in a bit
Yeah.
because I want to talk about some other elements of your book. But for a moment, I want to talk about the setting because Montana can almost seem like another character. And it's so big and it's so important in the series, but almost like
Mm.
quietly important. So, why did you want to set these stories here? What about it calls to you as the writer? And what do you hope it evokes in the reader?
So I think I picked Montana because my mother-in-law is the daughter of a cattle rancher from Montana. So I had hands-on, like someone to sort of answer all of my questions. I also have lived in very rural areas for all of my life, basically. And so it's something that I can write about in an authentic way. I think in terms of setting it in such a rural place, and the Montana that my books are set in is a slightly fictionalized Montana. Like, it's not meant to be exactly like real Montana. It's meant to be a sort of even more rural version of it, an even more wild version of it in terms of just in terms of space and the people around them. I think that when you're telling a story and you have sort of these extreme storylines, you need the space to move within your story, and putting people characters, I guess, into very rural environments allows them you to kind of strip back and make them a more concentrated version of who they are. And there's also like a persistent theme in a lot of the books of this kind of old idea that you see in like myths and everywhere, honestly, of like finding yourself is sort of going out into the wild. Like, people take retreats, they backpack, they go on, I guess, pilgrimages, and they find that a more true version of themselves. So I think it is supposed to follow that kind of concept of going out into the wilderness and sort of confronting all of the things that you need to confront and figuring out who you are and what you want. So I think all of those kind of factor into why I wanted it to be that sort of fictionalized version of Montana and why I wanted it to be so rural.
Yeah, and then it's interesting because isolation and being under resourced or there not being this interconnected feeling, you're in a really remote place, also impacts all of the decision making that these characters have to go through. So it is really interesting when, yeah, it's a small town, but it's even smaller because it's not really a town. And it's
Mhm.
all of these families interacting with one another and reputations and what they feel like they're owed and old grudges and all of that. So it was really, it adds so much texture to the story. And you're right, like they're going through so much. And to have that take place in New York City would not quite be the same thing. So the fact that
Yeah.
they're in these wide open, wild spaces is so beautiful in the stories. And I was thinking about one of the other elements that really stands out to me is the pacing of the books versus the time frame. So your books are so well paced. I mean, they're just
Thank
written
you.
beautifully. I feel that way. I love your writing. So we could gush about that. But it's interesting because there's so much yearning, and this takes place over a longer period of time. This is not taking
Mhm.
place in 1 month, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. What was that choice to make them so fast-paced, but to have these stories span time and people having to wait and be patient and almost perseverate on what they want and kind of build it in their minds before they could actually create a plan?
Doing that, I think, helps me when I'm telling a story be able to build a proper character arc because everybody wants to see growth. Like, nobody likes it when the character just doesn't change at all. And I think, one of the main things people tell you when you're learning storytelling structure is like right away you need to give your characters something that they want more than anything. And I think that's where the sort of feeling of the characters yearning comes from, is they always have something that they want or something that they're trying to get away from, or both. And I think when it comes to the spans of time, some of them are actually short, but you wouldn't know it. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what I did there. Sovereign, I could be saying that, I could be thinking this because there is a cut. So if you've read Sovereign, it starts, there's a little intro, there's a cut 7 months later. But when you actually like break down the time that's passed, the storyline of Sovereign is about 3 months, maybe a little less because it's late September. And then I think it concludes in November. So they get together real quick. But I think it feels like a long time because there is that yearning that you're talking about of they're kind of contending with everything all at once. They're doing an enormous amount of development as people and as a couple, people trying to be in some kind of relationship and trying to figure out what that is and dealing with traumas and baggage and that kind of thing. But throughout all of that, there is this constant sort of yearning for more. And I think a yearning for change. I think a lot of the characters, like they themselves, especially I wouldn't say this about all of the male main characters, but a lot of them have that component of sort of they want to change somewhat. I wouldn't say Sovereign is like that. I think he's just what you see is what you get.
All the other guys.
But yeah, yeah, I would say, like, I think that Weston for sure was very much one of those male main characters who he found that he really wanted to change and that he was willing to. His story does take place over like a long time, and there is a lot of yearning in it because it's kind of like a secret relationship.
You know what's interesting about what you just said? You had said when you're writing these characters, it's what do they want more than anything? And what was really interesting in Weston, more so than either of the other books, was Diane knew exactly what she wanted: this house, this property, this land. Like this was what she wanted. She envisioned this for herself. And it's interesting. There was almost this transfer of want where he enters her life, and all of a sudden it's like there's shape to this thing he wants. Like he sees himself in her kitchen. He sees them living there. He sees all of this. So I just thought it was really beautiful, this shared dream and yearning that happens when these two characters come together. And you would have never known just walking onto that property, like, that's where I want to raise
Yeah,
my kid. That's where I want to spend forever. So that was so beautifully done in that story. And
thank you.
yeah, I just love that. I'd never thought of it that way. So thanks for mentioning that. I feel like you've
Yeah.
planted a seed in my mind.
And I think for Weston is so usually when I write one of these books, there is kind of a thing that sort of represents the female main character getting her autonomy back. These are little spoilers if you haven't read them, so you can just skip past this. Like in Sovereign, he gives her land, he gives her half of what he has. And in Deacon, like, she ends up, she has a job. She has, like, if you've read the follow up, the novella that comes with it, she gets a business. But in Weston, Diane very much like you were saying, knew what she wanted, and Weston giving that to her, but also it's significant that he didn't rename the farm. It continued to be Carter Farms, which is her family name. And that was on purpose. But that was sort of him, like, he enters and fits into sort of the vision that Diane has. And so they kind of differ in that way than the
Yeah.
other sort of couples in the series.
Oh, I was obsessed with them. I mean, I loved all of your books, but I was like, those are my babies. I love those two. So
Thank
let's
you.
talk about something you just mentioned. You talked about the follow-up novellas. And while as a reader, those things are incredible, it doesn't always happen for a book. So why was it important for this series in particular to follow up on our favorite characters many years down the line? Why was that important for you to put out there for your readers?
So I think you can sort of thank my alpha reader and very good friend, Corinne, who reads everything that I've written, even the stuff that never sees the light of day. She always says, like, these poor characters have gone through so much. She was like, it is whenever she reads like a novella, finishes like beta alpha reading it or whatever, she's always like, it's so good to just see them like catch a break. And I think, like, she's right. I think there is that aspect when you have what is kind of like almost like an action adventure book where there's things happening continuously, like boom, boom, boom. You don't really get a time to breathe. They don't get time to kind of enjoy their lives because there's usually something terrible happening. And I think, well, you don't have to read the novellas. I just want to say that the books conclude, they have epilogues. I think for the people who just want a chance to see the couple be happy, that's what they're for. I also really like writing the couples as they get older and that they still have that spark. They still have a good connection. They probably have a better connection because, things get better kind of as they go. And then seeing them navigate through different stages of life than they would have at the beginning. Because I mean, most romances, other than like Second Chance, or they oftentimes focus on like that beginning period. But I think sometimes the other parts are just as good and interesting.
Oh, yeah. Like in real life, if you're in a long-term
Yeah.
partnership, you're in multiple relationships throughout your life with that one person because the relationship you
Mhm.
have when you're 45 is not the relationship you had when you're 35. And there's something so beautiful and powerful about that of aging with someone that you love and going through those things together. So that's so generous as a writer to also put that out there for us, that we get to experience these people further down the line and see how their relationships evolve just, after the
Mhm.
trauma and the healing, sort of in that
Yeah.
stage where they're moving into a different part of their lives. So that is so
Mhm.
beautiful. We've covered so much ground about your stories and so many of the elements that really stand out. But, at their core, these are romances. And there is a lot of heat and attraction and spice. And there's a lot going on in these stories. I want to talk to you about why that was important in these stories that are talking about such deep, profound, life-changing relationships. Why is that invitation to follow our main characters into that aspect of the relationship so important in the storytelling?
So I think some of it is a choice of wanting to tell a specific type of story in a specific way. And some of it is just as people, we don't really get to sort of compartmentalize away from those heavy topics and things that happen and how it affects us. So I think everything, like with the characters in the book, everything that you are that makes up you, you bring that with you all the time, which is something that is touched on in the books, especially in Deacon, where I think he's thinking about kind of the trauma that was done to her. And he's like, she has to carry this forever. Like she's going to wake up with it. She goes to bed with it. Like she carries it always, kind of thing. And so that is going to come out in the open door, like in the bedroom kind of thing. You don't get to compartmentalize, or the characters don't really get to compartmentalize that and just sort of become different people when they get to that aspect of their lives, like the more intimate sort of aspects of their lives. So I think that for me, it was very important to be able to show these things and have a sort of a broad, holistic view, point, and place to kind of study them.
I really feel that. And it's interesting because you're inviting us to explore so many aspects of their relationship through this, right? There's surrender, there's trust, there's power exchanges, there's communication, language, nonverbal communication, all of these things that are forming in this dynamic between the main characters. But at the core, this is a story of flawed characters, right? Flawed people doing their best to get their needs met and connect with their partner. It's not a kink manual, it's not a BDSM
Yeah.
manual. So, what is that like for you as the writer? And what are you putting into these stories to just kind of make sure that people really understand where you're coming from? That again, it's fiction and it's flawed relationships and things go wrong sometimes, or boundaries are crossed, or people have to communicate what they want. How do you do that as a writer in these stories?
Well, first, in all my books, when you open them, there is a disclaimer that basically says this is a work of fiction. There are a lot of things in the book that I would not advise that you do, and it shouldn't be used as a manual because ultimately it is a story before it is anything else for what I'm writing. But in terms of just being responsible and being thoughtful. I think thoughtful is the right word. That's sort of my goal. And I do get that feedback is people like the representation. I don't know if representation is the right word because again, I'm not trying to represent something exactly as it ought to be in real life, but they like that it is thoughtful and that it's emotionally driven and connected in that way in terms of kind of what is it like to have like, because obviously you're just writing something you don't really know how it will be received. But it's kind of like when you have to give a speech and you're in a room full of people and you're like, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my research. I'm going to take my notes and then to the best that I can be, say the thing that I need to say and do it in a thoughtful way. And that does come with research. It comes with talking to people. It comes with having people read the books. And then at the end of it, when you've taken sort of all your precautions and you've done your best, that's when you have to kind of let it go and trust that people will understand that it is a fictional book.
What do you think has been a misunderstanding, particularly around that part of the books? Have you received any feedback or something that you want to clarify?
Honestly, there's not a lot. I think that people do read that disclaimer in the beginning. There is, like, a couple things that people will bring up where they're like, "I'm disappointed that in this circumstance that the female main character who is in the submissive role didn't pick her own safe word." And I do get people contacting me and telling me that, and I'm like, I do know that." But for the sake of the storyline and also this female main character who comes into it very sort of not knowledgeable, that's why it is that way. And that's why I have the disclaimer that's like, this is not technically accurate. It's not meant to be technically accurate. It's adjusted so that the characters make sense, so that you don't have a character who would never know this thing suddenly knowing it out of nowhere. I have always felt and I have always gotten very positive feedback when it comes to the BDSM in the books. And I don't know why. I mean, other than like, I tried to be very like careful and writing these things in a way that is thoughtful, but I
Yeah.
tend to get all kinds of negative feedback on other things, but I don't get a lot on that in particular. So it's not really something that comes up like a ton other than
Yeah.
that one little thing about people writing to inform me about the safe words. I'm like, I know it's fine.
The
But
character.
yeah, I'm like,
No, I know.
I do know, but it's fine. Yeah.
So it's interesting because I did an interview last week, and the writer I was talking to said, it's kind of interesting how I'm writing these big stories. They're so layered. We're talking about so many different things, real life things, relationships, finances, abuse, trauma, all of this. And my writing gets reduced to smut, or like someone had said her writing is porn. And she's like, well, I mean, there's relationships and it's wonderfully spicy. There's all of this in the books, but at its core, I'm writing these big stories. So I want to check in with you. How do you feel about that? Where are you with the interpretation or misinterpretation? And particularly because it's written by women mostly and it's for women.
Yeah.
And how much does that play into it?
Let me see. I could go on and on about this for like a long time, but I'm trying to condense it down because I think that I do get it a lot. And just in terms of one of the most remarked upon things in the series is the smut, the spice, whatever you want to call it. And it's not that it isn't there. Like, I am not going to pretend that it isn't there because it's there for a reason. However, when you're looking at people and their lives in a sort of overarching way, you're standing back from it. Those things are things, they're part of life. And I personally, well, I understand there are books that, you're not going to have sex in those books. And that's why I read a lot of books that are not romances. But I think compartmentalizing those so separately from each other in such a harsh way is sort of odd. And it's not something that I see happen to male writers as much, or writers who write in other genres. I read a lot of like literary fiction, grit, that kind of thing. And there's oftentimes very explicit scenes in those books. And those books they're very well regarded. They're heavily distributed. We unfortunately are like, I'm in a genre that gets a lot of heat and a lot of criticism for that. And I think a lot of it is that it's heavily written by and run by women. But yeah, like, I always kinda come back to there's nothing in my books that is not in a book written by a man that wasn't normalized and that was not critiqued. I don't wanna get on
Yeah.
my soapbox too
No,
much.
I would love if you got on your soapbox. Maybe we'll just have you come back and do a whole episode about that. But
Absolutely.
no,
I mean,
yeah.
I have a lot to say about it as, like, I didn't really start reading romance until later. Like I was saying, I've read a lot of, like, Cormac McCarthy, that kind of thing, and they just don't get critiqued like those male authors. They don't get critiqued about the things that we are critiqued about as female authors. I don't find there to be anything in my books that is not commonly in books written by men, I guess. But yeah, I could talk about it for a while.
Well, to have you come back on, and like I said, we'll devote a whole episode to it because no, I just think it's really interesting. I have friends who work in like TV and film writing, and their stuff is seen as genius, and they're all men,
Mhm.
and they're writing about things that are horrible for women. And when women are writing stories that are empowering for women or focus on their
Yeah.
safety or pleasure, it's reduced. And I just find it really interesting, especially because I think storytelling is so powerful, and it brings me back to kind of what we had spoken about at the beginning of the episode of like, I wish I had heard this or read this when I was younger. And just that disconnection from story is a great way to keep people uninformed or under-resourced or confused or insecure. But when
Mhm.
women share stories in community, very publicly and openly, there's a lot of power in that. There's a reclaiming of
Yeah.
agency. So, I mean,
And
I'm getting on my
I wanna
soapbox.
add yeah, absolutely. I wanna add a little bit onto what you were just saying, where women sharing stories is so important, and I think that's why it's been policed for so long. I mean, at a certain point, like, it was considered, like, not well regarded for women to read novels, period,
Yeah.
and I don't see that what is happening around the conversations and romance and dark romance is anything other than that in a modern setting. I firmly believe that women telling stories to each other is a survival mechanism. I think that's how we, a long, long, long time ago, sort of differentiated between who in our groups of people that we were living with in villages and stuff, who was a problem, who you needed to stay away from, that kind of thing. And I think to some degree, the Sovereign Mountain series is that. Like, it's a critique of harmful men. So,
And that
yeah.
is very important, by the way. So
Yeah.
I didn't want to minimize that or just like brush that aside because I think it just really is. It's beautiful, it's important. And one thing I always say at work, I work with a whole team of women, which is incredible. It's my favorite thing. But we always say the only red flag is when we're not allowed to talk about something because you
Yeah.
can talk about anything. We have a safe container. We all respect each other. The red flag would be if somebody said, you can't talk about that. And so we always use
Mhm.
that as our baseline. And so even when it comes to fiction and there's critiques about things, especially in the genre of dark romance, I think it's really important to unpack it and talk about it and speak about it in these interviews with writers. Because I just think on the simplest level, I feel like it brings so much awareness to emotions and what's going on with us internally and how cut off we can be. And so even if we can drop into empathy with a character, right? Like Diane, she
Yeah.
was going through it in your book. She was really
Mhm.
going through it, and there's a point where the reader could be completely frustrated with her, right? Like, that's a
Yeah.
human response, and instead, you have this convergence of understanding and empathy, and it creates that awareness in yourself of like, "Oh, I'm probably doing that to people in my life. I'm not seeing where they're
Yeah.
coming from. I'm not seeing their fears and their insecurities, and I'm probably rushing them or pushing them or not being as understanding, and what actually helped heal this character? Someone being understanding, being patient,
Yeah.
being loving, all of those things. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, I could talk about this for hours. So,
Well, really quick, what you were saying really quick about Diane specifically, I think you see, like we were talking about isolation versus being able to talk about things. And it's also an intentional theme that you see in the Sovereign Mountain series, where you usually will have a woman who is in a male dominated environment and not being able to speak and interact with other women is
Mhm.
also, I think, sort of an abuse tactic, and it also keeps you very isolated and easier to control because you're not able to bounce off of other women, like, "Is this a problem or not?" And I know in my actual life, like, I've experienced that. Like, you need that, and so you see a lot of these women who are in super isolated situations go to having positive female friendships and seeing like, they'll see another woman being like, "I see that she is treated well, like, I deserve that too," kind of thing. So, yeah, I think that is, like, super important to point out, like, isolation versus being able to have some kind of sense of community. That makes sense?
100%. And I'm glad we're talking about it. And I feel like that is one of those themes that someone could be reading about in your book for the very first time and feel like, oh, I didn't even realize that the feeling I have is that I am isolated or I am cut off, or I'm
Yeah.
seeing, oh, she has this one interaction with this woman and she's nervous and doesn't know what to say because she just does not have the practice. Her practice is hugging the
Yeah.
wall and being invisible and
Mhm.
making sure no one freaks out on her. And like, I think that's the power of the storytelling. I love that we've been able to go so deep into this beautiful series, and I love that you've touched on all of these topics that I think so many of your readers were wondering about and curious about. So, tell us about another one of your series that you've written for any reader who's like me, who kind of fell in love with this world you created and just wants to dive deep into your catalog.
So I do have another ongoing series. I have the Welsh King series. Well, it's technically a trilogy. The third book is not out yet, but I like to describe it as kind of like ancient Rome inspired meets like Gossip Girl. And I know that makes no sense. It really doesn't, but it is sort of a spin. It's definitely a spin on mafia romance. A lot of people read it and they're like, this is really different from mafia. I call it mafia light because I don't want people to go in expecting a certain thing and not get it. They're not like dark, dark romance. I would say they're like semi-dark. Like there will usually be like an event or something that's maybe a little more violent, that kind of thing. But then the rest of it's a little bit lighter. And the first one is Paradise Descent, and that is age gap, father's best friend. The second one is Prince of Ink and Scars, and that is kind of like a workplace rivals to lovers. They're being kind of like forced to work with each other on a project. But that one is not age gap. That's my only non-age gap book I think that I've ever written. So yeah, that's interesting. I just realized that. So
Yeah. We'll unpack that next time. And what's coming up next for the Sovereign Mountain series? Because all of us listening have seen teasers on your social media. So can you tell us anything about what's coming next?
Jensen is next. It's already written. I'm done with it. It's just waiting to come out. Jensen was probably like one of the hardest books that I've written. And I know I say that. Like if you read my acknowledgments, it's always like, this was the hardest thing I've ever written. I wrote Jensen in a very short period of time. And then I rewrote it in that same period of time. So in like 4 weeks, I probably wrote over 150,000 words. And I was kind of exhausted from that. And, it's a very emotional book. It has a lot of really heavy topics in it. I kind of, like, crashed right after I finished it, but it focuses a lot on different types of consent and kind of, like, the damage that can be done when people have some pivotal sort of choices made for them, which is in line with the themes you see in the other books. The 2 main characters are really different than anything that I've written before. They're like the opposite of opposites attract. They're like the same person almost. They're both very sassy, very like strong-willed, very much like go-getters. It's also like very fast-paced in comparison with the other books. I can't think of any other word other than like it's like kind of swashbuckling. Like, like I haven't thought of that word since like Pirates of the Caribbean, but like it's like action adventure. Like when my alpha reader read it for this book, she was like, it's giving like it's kind of Bonnie and Clyde. Like they're in it together. There's a lot of action, a lot of adventure, a lot going on. So I'm very excited for that one. It's different. Like it definitely, is part of the series kind of thing. I actually have someone who reads for that and checks to make sure that everything is like still feels like part of the series, but a little different than the other ones for sure. In terms of the other things that I have, other than that I can talk about, I have a secret age gap romance that I can't talk about though, because it's kind of like spoilers for another book that hasn't come out yet. But then I'm working on a Why Choose Dark Cowboy romance, and I've never written Why Choose before, so this is fun. It's been fun. But this one, I think if you really like Sovereign, like the first book, you will like the Why Choose one. It goes back to those themes of sort of isolation, and it's very dark. It's very like brutal and like gritty. It focuses on this super, super tiny isolated town in Wyoming. It's maybe a little disturbing. I think there is almost an aspect of horror to it, not a strong one. It's still very much a dark romance, but I think it kind of touches on a lot of similar themes to what you see in the Sovereign Mountain series, like themes that you find throughout literature for centuries, like, jealousy and violence and like sacrifice and all of these things. I'm very excited about that one, and I can't wait to be able to say more about it.
Well, just leave that as a promise that you'll come back. We'll do another shorter episode and we'll definitely explore some of your next projects. So I'm just really excited that you're putting out so many more books and stories, and I can't wait to see what comes out. So I'm loving that you shared what you did, and I can't wait to jump into the Welsh Kings because I feel like that's going to be next on my list. So Rhea, we have talked about the importance of women telling stories and sharing stories. And one aspect of this podcast is the love letter aspect. And so when I invited you on, I asked if you could read a love letter either to your younger self or your readers. So I would love to give you the floor to share your love letter with us.
So I don't want to traumatize anyone, so I did not write a love letter to myself. This is to my readers, though it's very short, but I feel like it kind of says what I want to say. So, dear reader, this letter is for you, anyone who has read the Sovereign Mountain series and saw themselves in the main characters, especially Kira, Diane, and Freya, and soon to be Della, when Jensen comes out. Life is very hard. It can be difficult and scary. Along the way, we meet people and situations that hurt us very badly. But it's also the greatest adventure we ever go on, and I hope that you have a beautiful home, a table of food, friends you can rely on, and a love so deep and comfortable that you have to remind yourself not to take it for granted. I hope that when you look back, you have decades of happiness to reflect on. Everyone deserves that, including you, and I hope that message comes through in the words that I put on paper. That is my wish and my love letter to you.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. And I feel like your readers are really feeling that in the books that you're putting out and the stories and characters that you're
Thank
sharing.
you.
So I would love to close out this episode with you sharing with all of us where we can find you. Where should we contact you? Where are you on the internet? And what's coming up for you?
So, the best place to get the most updated information about everything is my Instagram. I do also have TikTok. I do have a Facebook. It's linked, but I don't use it. But the best place to get like the most updated information, if there's ever anything that's kind of like time sensitive, is my Instagram for sure. I do have a newsletter that goes out sometimes. And in terms of my events, I do have all of my signings listed like on my website, along with like links and everything. Some of them might be sold out, so I'm sorry if they are. But yeah, that's where I kind of am online, and that's where I am in person.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to put links to your social media and website in the show notes. So make sure if you want to sign up for Raya's newsletter, you can get that through the show notes as well. So I just want to say thank you so much for being here with all of us and talking about your books and your characters and your process. We all love the Sovereign Mountain series and are so excited for Jensen and Jack. Just thank you for being here. And I really hope you come back and join us again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on and also letting me talk about some of this. Writers, I feel like, are kind of solitary people. So it's super fun to be able to talk about kind of these like fictional worlds and stories. And I really appreciated all of your questions. I felt that they really kind of hit the heart of the Sovereign Mountain series.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Love Letters and Books, a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to follow, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can find me on both Instagram and TikTok at Love Letters and Books. And if you're interested in being a guest on Love Letters and Books, suggesting your favorite author, or just want to write in an original love letter to yourself or someone else to be read on air, please send me an email at lovelettersandmixtapes@gmail.com.